Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to combine men's interests and women's interests. We're going to start out with two old-line, old-school sports figures, and the first is Earl Morrall, who died recently at the age of 79, and Earl Morrall has been called the greatest second-string quarterback in NFL history. Earl was born in Muskegon, Michigan, and went to Michigan State. He's one of the greatest athletes in Michigan State history. He quarterbacked them to a Rose Bowl and a 9-1 season, and he also played on a College World Series baseball team. He had a distinctive crew cut that he wore for his whole life, and I also read somewhere that he cut off a toe while he was mowing the lawn one day. He was drafted and played for a little while for the 49ers and then for the Steelers, and he was traded for Bobby Lane, went to the Lions, and he became a very good quarterback for the Lions. He alternated with Mill Plum in the early 60s, but then came the seasons that made his career so memorable. In 1968, he ultimately wound up with the Colts, and in the last game of the exhibition season, the Colts' legendary quarterback Johnny Unitas was injured, so Morrall quarterbacked the team to a 13-1 record and won the most valuable player in the league award. The Colts were thought to be unbeatable, but as we've talked about before, they were beaten in the most memorable Super Bowl game ever by the Jets 16-7, and Morrall caught a lot of opprobrium for a famous play at the end of the first half where he missed a wide-open Jimmy Orr in the end zone. We talked about that in detail in the Jim Hudson podcast that we did because Jim Hudson intercepted the pass that went to another player. In 1971, Morrall was the backup behind Unitas when Unitas got injured in the Super Bowl, and Morrall quarterbacked the Colts to a come-from-behind victory against the Cowboys' doomsday defense. So he won a Super Bowl where he was the backup, and he lost the Super Bowl where he was the starter. In 1972, he wound up with the Miami Dolphins, and he was the backup to Bob Griese. 1972, of course, for you football fans, was the Dolphins' undefeated season. In the middle of the season, Griese got hurt. Morrall stepped in. He preserved their undefeated season into the playoffs. He struggled in the AFC Championship game. Don Shula replaced him with Griese, who was coming back from the injury. Don Shula, ironically, was his coach in 1968 with the Colts also. Anyway, Shula decided to go with Griese in the Super Bowl against the Redskins. They won, thereby becoming the only undefeated team in NFL history. Morrall was upset about being replaced in that Super Bowl game, but again, he was old school and he understood, and he was rewarded by being named the AFC Conference Player of the Year and the Comeback Player of the Year. Here's an NFL report on Earl Morrall.
He's the answer to several historical NFL trivia questions, but to those who knew him, of course, Earl Morrall was much, much more. According to the Associated Press, the man who played 21 seasons as an NFL quarterback died Thursday morning at the age of 79. The Dolphins confirmed the news earlier today. Morrall is most well known for being Joe Namath's opposing quarterback in Super Bowl III when the Jets upset the Colts. Morrall had filled in that season for Johnny Unitas, who was hurt in the preseason. Morrall also started 9 games for the Dolphins during the 1972 perfect season, substituting for Bob Griese until the AFC Championship game. He was the second overall pick of the 49ers in the 1956 draft after leading Michigan State to a shared national championship and Rose Bowl win. He also played for the Steelers, Lions, and Giants. After his playing career, he became quarterbacks coach at the University of Miami, where he tutored future first-round picks Jim Kelly, Bernie Kosar, and Vinny Testaverde. Again, Earl Morrall is dead at the age of 79.
So Earl Morrall is one of the memorable names in NFL history, and ironically, his 2 greatest regular seasons both ended in frustration. We're going to move on now to another old-school guy, Dr. Jack Ramsay, who died recently at the age of 89, and Dr. Jack Ramsay was one of the great coaches and commentators in NBA history. He was a brilliant basketball mind. He got his basketball training in that proving ground of Philadelphia. We've talked about Philadelphia as a proving ground for basketball before, most recently with Tom Gola's podcast. Jack Ramsay graduated from St. Joseph's in Philadelphia and ultimately went on to coach there, and he had a quite successful coaching stint there. And then he went on and coached several teams in the NBA, but he's best known for being the coach of the 1977 Portland Trailblazers, one of the great teams in NBA history. Let's run through the starters on that team quickly. Bill Walton, who was at the height of his talents, is one of the 5 greatest centers in NBA history, perhaps the greatest passing center of all time. Maurice Lucas, whose podcast we've done, one of the great power forwards in NBA history. At the small forward, they had a splendid player in Bobby Gross. And in the backcourt, they had one of the great backcourts in NBA history with Dave Twardzik, a wonderful shooter, and Lionel Hollins, an all-around great and smart player. The '77 Trailblazers embodied Ramsay's approach. They emphasized team basketball and ball movement. I would say they blew through the playoffs, except they didn't. They were almost beaten in the first round by the Chicago Bulls. The Bulls were led by Tom Boerwinkle, Artis Gilmore, and Norm Van Leer. And in the third and final game of the series, the Bulls made a ferocious comeback. Were down a couple of points with about 15 seconds to go, and Lionel Hollins buried a deep 25-foot shot to seal the game. I talked with Norm Van Leer about that right before he died, and he told me it was still one of the most painful memories of his entire basketball career. Trailblazers went on to beat a great 76ers team led by Julius Erving in the finals and earned their place in NBA history. Again, they embodied Jack Ramsay's style of basketball. They probably would have won more NBA titles, but Walton injured his foot and was never the same player, and gradually that great team broke up. That was the apotheosis of Ramsay's NBA coaching career. He coached for a couple more years after that, but he gained a name as one of the best commentators in the sport. He explained the game to fans and viewers very simply and broke it down so that everyone could understand it, and he was also a great teacher of basketball, everywhere from future NBA players to kids learning the game in Zimbabwe on courts with broken glass strewn all over. It's safe to say that there have been very few people in the history of basketball who've had a greater knowledge and passion for the game than Dr. Jack Ramsay. We're going to move on now to John C. Houbolt, who died at the age of 95, one of the instrumental figures in the Apollo program and a critical figure in the Americans reaching the moon in 1969. He was a nice Dutch boy from Altoona, Iowa, who moved to Joliet, Illinois, went to Joliet High here in Illinois, and then went to Joliet Junior College, and then became an engineer at the University of Illinois and moved to NASA. In the early 1960s, when President Kennedy charged NASA with building a rocket to go to the moon, there was a debate how to do it, whether it should be a direct rocket flight from the Earth to the moon, as Wernher von Braun proposed, or whether a module should be launched from an Earth-orbiting rocket. Both of those were not only technically very difficult, but also prohibitively expensive. John Houbolt, as the voice in the wilderness, proposed a third option, a lunar orbiting module. He bypassed the natural chain of command in NASA, which in those days was a big deal, and he asked, do you guys want to go to the moon or not? And his cheaper, lighter, and less complicated approach of lunar orbiting rendezvous ultimately won the day.
The Apollo spacecraft will consist of 3 modules. The command module will carry the 3-man crew together with guidance, communications, and life support systems. The service module will contain propulsion systems for mid-course maneuvers, as well as for entering and escaping the lunar orbit. The lunar excursion module will carry 2 crew members to the surface of the moon, along with scientific instruments, communications, and guidance systems. It also will have a propulsion capability for lunar landing and for return to the orbiting command and service modules.
Here's a brief report on the genius of Joliet, John Houbolt.
John Houbolt was little known, but his big ideas made the Apollo moon landings possible, an unsung hero of the space race. Born in 1919, Houbolt's career began in 1942 at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NASA's predecessor. He stayed on at NASA when it became operational in 1958.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
When President Kennedy announced his goal of landing on the moon, there were 2 competing ideas about how to get there. One was to launch a spacecraft directly to the moon on a massive rocket called the Nova. The other was to launch a fleet of Saturn V's, and together they'd assemble the moonship in Earth's orbit before sending it to the moon. Both ideas were incredibly expensive and complex. Houbolt knew the U.S. would never get to the moon before the end of the 60s if NASA went with either option. Building on the work he'd done since the 40s, he put forth the idea of splitting the moonship into 2 parts. One would take the astronauts into lunar orbit. The other would land them on the moon.
Preparation for the lunar module descent to the moon now begin.
What followed was the Apollo Command and Service Module and the Lunar Landing Module, which could be launched with 1 Saturn V rocket. It took 2 years for him to convince NASA that his idea was not only the best way, but the only way to get to the moon. It was a fight Houbolt was unwilling to back down on. And because he didn't, the U.S. won the space race with Apollo 11's lunar landing in 1969.
Oh, beautiful. Very smooth. Very quiet ride.
We're going to close tonight with our feature on the Ladies' Home Journal, which first published in 1883. So I guess we can say it died at the age of 131. Here's Myrna Blythe, who was a former editor of Ladies' Home Journal, commenting on the demise of the magazine in National Review Online. When I was editor of the Ladies' Home Journal, I once presented the 100th anniversary copy to President Ronald Reagan. Great, he said, something older than I am in the Oval Office. Yes, this little anecdote acknowledges Reagan's spontaneous, self-deprecating wit, but it also shows that at one time the President of the United States would take time in his busy schedule to salute America's oldest women's magazine. That's because Ladies' Home Journal, which will cease monthly publishing with its July issue, was then considered America's premier women's publication with a circulation of 6 million. So it's a sad ending for the publication that was launched in 1883 by Cyrus Curtis, who also started the Saturday Evening Post. Ladies' Home Journal developed out of the popular women's page in Curtis's first publication, a periodical for farmers. His wife was the first editor, and the second, a Dutch immigrant named Edward Bach, was the editorial genius who transformed the journal into a mass magazine for millions. Early in the 20th century, Bach had great insight about what would interest modern readers. In every issue, he featured the celebrities of the day, including Civil War generals, actresses, presidents, and members of the British royal family. He also crusaded against popular patent medicines, distillations of alcohol and opium, which addicted many middle-class women at the time. And he wrote shockingly straightforward editorials warning women about sexual diseases such as syphilis. Yes, Bach seemed to know celebrity, sex, and addiction would become basic subjects for the popular press. Through the decades, reflecting the nation's economy, the magazine had its ups and downs. However, many consider the 1940s and 50s to be the golden age for Ladies' Home Journal and the other large circulation women's service magazines known as the Seven Sisters. Then at the helm was a husband and wife editing team, Beatrice and Bruce Gould, who published serious news about World War II for wives and mothers on the home front and launched the journal's best-known and longest-running feature, Can This Marriage Be Saved?, as a way to teach couples about the value of marriage counseling. The magazine was so prestigious, in fact, that Marilyn Monroe complained to Edward R. Murrow that while she had appeared on many magazine covers, she was unhappy because she had never been on the cover of the Ladies' Home Journal. In the 1970s, a group of feminists believed that Ladies' Home Journal was not acknowledging the importance of the incipient women's movement and the changes happening in women's lives. They staged a sit-in at the office of the editor-in-chief, John Mack Carter. Carter agreed to publish their manifesto. Afterward, he said he did it because he was afraid the women were not going to let him go to the bathroom. The journal's readers were not enthusiastic about the feature that was published. I came to be the editor of Ladies' Home Journal in the beginning of the 1980s when the magazine was, once again, in quite serious trouble. It was up for sale only a short time after I arrived, and no major publishing company wanted to buy it. An entrepreneur finally took over with hardly any money changing hands, but he was supportive of the editorial changes I made. I knew the Ladies' Home Journal was best when it was the most journalistic of women's magazines. I sent reporters to work with Mother Teresa, locate the injured children of Chernobyl, and interview Margaret Thatcher, Marina Oswald, and Mary Jo Kopechne's bitter parents. With the help of a talented editorial staff, a strong advertising team, and the appearance of Princess Diana, who frequently graced the cover, the magazine suddenly grew popular and profitable again. The entrepreneur sold the magazine after only a few years to the Meredith Corporation for $90 million. In its last years, Ladies' Home Journal was hurt by competition from websites, a new batch of women's magazines, and the fact that the journal's readers were primarily in their 50s. Advertisers don't want baby boomers, even though boomers remain the largest and richest demographic. So editors run from the most loyal and engaged readers, and publishing companies are uninterested in them and not supportive of content aimed at them. The journal became a generic service magazine, and women can get that kind of information both offline and online. So yes, it is very sad when a great magazine is gone, particularly when it's a magazine that in its best days was distinctive and distinguished, that reported on, reflected, and celebrated the lives of America's extraordinary women. But please remember that Ladies' Home Journal's slogan was the most beloved of any magazine. Never underestimate the power of a woman. And even though many have called the magazine old-fashioned of late, I can practically guarantee you'll be hearing quite a lot of Ladies' Home Journal's slogan as the 2016 presidential election cycle draws near. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. And to honor Ladies' Home Journal, we're going to close with a tribute to a woman by Smokey Robinson. Not sung by the Temptations, but by one of the first rock groups to have two women in it, the Mamas and the Papas.
I don't need money.